The folks that think they're trying to fight inflation are only fighting what is the consequence of inflation and rising prices. And when you look at Kamala's platform, she talks about giving a $6,000 tax credit for families with a new child, or $25,000 down payment for 400,000 first-generation home buyers, or $10,000 tax credit for the first-time home buyers. Who pays for all that? We're already $35 trillion broke on top of unfunded liabilities. Where does that money come from? So, in essence, at the same time she's inflating through policy by creating money to fund these initiatives, and we can't afford them, then she turns around and blames the problem on the grocery stores for price gouging when it's the government that created the inflation to begin with. Inflation is always, every single time, a monetary event. It's an inflation of the money supply, an increase in the money supply. That is what causes inflation. And when we are creating, in essence, $100,000 a second, 24/7, or $1 trillion every 100 days, well, that's inflation. The rising prices aren't inflation, and we've been indoctrinated into believing the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, take the L out of that, and it just be the BS, is inflation. That's not. Rising prices are a symptom of inflation. It's the irresponsibility, fiscal policy, and brain-dead monetary policy of the Fed and of the government that are creating these distortions to begin with. And it just goes to show how uninformed the public is, and certainly how uninformed someone like Kamala Harris is in saying this nonsense. I mean, just looking at it alone, just the cost of farmers to process, package, and deliver their food has gone up 31% since she's taken office as the vice president, and yet she's blaming it on grocery stores. I used to joke that this industry might be the only industry that makes less than the grocery stores, who make on average 1.5%. They're not the problem. The problem is through all of the inputs that have gone up in cost, fuel and seed and certainly fertilizer, most of which comes from Russia, and all of these input costs have gone up, and blaming it on and then trying to impose, capping prices. You go back to the 70s and you read about that, you'll see that farmers had price caps on chicken, and the cost of raising baby chicks to the point at a full-grown chicken and slaughter it and bring it to the grocery store, it cost more to do that. So they were drowning baby chicks, killing them, because the cost of raising them to adulthood and then bringing them to be processed cost more than they were allowed to sell them for. All that does is create empty food shelves and distortions, and people drop out of it. It's communism. It's socialism. Capitalism says a company that can do it more efficiently and do it better, they win. And if you can do something more efficient for less money, that is the whole concept of capitalism, bringing value through efficiency instead of imposing, the government's will. And all that does is distort everything that they trust. It's a bad omen. That is a path that she is taking, rather than looking within and saying, geez, spending $100,000 a second 24/7 might be the real problem. Wasting our money all around the globe on initiatives we have no business being part of, or wars we have no business being part of. Well, maybe that's something we should look at. Instead, blaming the people who are running grocery stores at tiny margins. How about the margins we see on Wall Street? How about the margins we see other places? It's misdirected, and it's ignorant, and it's very troubling to me when you think about what could be if this administration takes power and starts implementing price controls like that. You'll end up with empty grocery stores and grocery store chains going out of business, and vilifying these people who are so crucial to everyone's life is just not the way to do it. Instead, look within, and that probably won't happen, but that's where the root problem is. Yeah, well, one of the biggest fallacies is that, people talking about BRICS establishing a common currency, and that these countries would need, of course, then they would need a central bank and presumably be held in China, which is an unacceptable loss of sovereignty, especially between countries like China and India with territorial conflicts. And well, you have the head of the BRICS New Development Bank who made it clear there are no immediate plans to create a common currency, which I agree. And even if they were willing to put aside their differences, it's hard to see what competitive advantage would ever have between to the current system. And then they talk about a gold-backed yuan, or they're missing and they always go back to the Eurodollar system, and that we left the gold-backed system to go to the Eurodollar system because it was such a better system. And, contrary to what people say, we had gone, I think, 180 years with no inflation and the greatest growth that the world has ever seen in a country by being on the gold-backed system. But I've been reading a lot of this lately, talking about this common fallacy is that, there won't be a common currency, and maybe there won't be. And if you look at what they're proposing right now, it is not a common currency. They are proposing everyone having their own central bank digital currency, having their own monetary autonomy. That's number one. And if you look at the global GDP and go 98% of all the gross domestic product of the world and the countries that represent that, every one of them has a CBDC in operation or development. That's number one. If you look at what's been done over the last year, all of these countries are trading in local currencies. They're trading rupee for a ruble digital, yuan for oil, and that yuan is convertible into gold in the Shanghai Gold Exchange. And all of these local currency tradings that are being done instead of the dollar is first and foremost. Project Mbridge is a vehicle or a platform to allow these countries to seamlessly trade back and forth with one another without interference of the SWIFT system. No Western intermediary banks. The dollar is not compatible with Mbridge, and Saudi Arabia just became a full participant in Mbridge. And what they are attempting to do, at least that's what Dilma Rousseff said, the head of the BRICS New Development Bank, former president of Brazil, is that we've agreed in principle to a common settlement currency. It is not a common BRICS currency. This is where people are going astray. They don't have to have a common currency in order for this to work, but a common settlement currency that is pegged 40% to gold and 60% to BRICS plus currencies eliminates the need for a common currency. Each country will have their own system, their own CBDC, their own monetary system, their own little economy that they have to manage and do so in a prudent way. They will not be reliant upon having to go back and forth in and out of dollars to transact with other countries and stand to the KYC and AML problems, the anti-money laundering and know your client, and the cost and the inefficiency and the time, when they can have a common settlement currency, which is addressed by having the gold held within this ecosystem. These unit tokens that they mint are held within the borders of the countries that possess it. They don't even have to send it to a central authority and have it independently and continuously audited. So when we talk about these fallacies that keep popping up that underestimate the relevance of what is happening, this group that is forming, I think they are grossly underestimating the intelligence and the sophistication of these countries who understand exactly the pushback. And instead of making a common currency with a common central bank, everyone holds their own autonomy. But when it comes time to settling, if I got too many rupee or I have too many ruble, I just want some common settlement token. Well, that's gold, and that's gold's role. And that's why the BIS reclassified it Tier 1. And that's why all the countries have been bringing it home, because it will be part of a new system. This is really important for people to understand. And I think it's a trend that's growing. It's literally accelerating. And you can see it in the price of gold. Well, one other thing I'd like to mention, a lot of people say, well, okay, fine. If all of these countries are accumulating gold, what does it mean for silver? And there are some very important things to understand about silver. Number one, first and foremost, China is the number 2 largest producer of silver in the world. And they, for many years, have been a net exporter because they mine all of these other metals. And if you remember, silver is largely a byproduct metal, where in North America, or I guess in all of the mining companies out there, only account for about 25-30% of the silver that comes to market. Most of it comes as a byproduct of mining other metals. So China and their smelters had tons of silver for years. They would export it. This year, they have now become shifted from net exporter to net importer. And it's been driven by increased imports and also by rebalancing their domestic market and not sending out all of this silver that they've been accumulating as a byproduct of other endeavors. And this, first and foremost, is really, really big. So the number 2 producer of silver in the world is now a net importer instead of a net exporter. And then all of the talk, I've done 2 interviews recently with mining executives, and both of them have said the same thing, that they are going around the world, China is, and in particular in Latin America, paying double what the West will pay for unrefined doré and silver concentrate, bringing it home and refining it there, and doing so that it doesn't come off of an exchange and affect the price. And so you have a massive drive by China and India. We know, we've documented all of their accumulation of silver to accumulate silver too. And China is going to great lengths to hide it in terms of how much they're producing and how much they're going around accumulating in unrefined forms, because it doesn't reflect in the price. Silver will have its day, and I think China is a perfect example of it. They do things thinking in terms of years and decades. We think in terms of minutes. You know, one of the biggest exporters in the world goes to net import, and they're already the number 2 largest producer in the world. It is not an industrial metal as we are led to believe. It's a strategic metal, and it is needed. And the countries of the global south are understanding that. And this is why they're draining the LBMA to the second lowest level they've ever had in the history of the exchange, 140 years. This is why they're draining the COMEX. And I think it's accelerating. So silver will have its day, and everything that we've ever talked about silver, I think, will happen in spades. It'll just happen in a manner. It will go from 0 to 100 just like that. We'll wake up and see it repriced, or to a whole different level when there just isn't the ability to accumulate it on the exchanges, which are being bled dry. And at some point, all of the people who have silver will be sold at a price far higher, and probably a price that is then revalued or controlled by countries like China, who, as it is right now, are selling it for $4 an ounce higher in Shanghai. What if it was $40 or $400? It's the same thing as us talking about revaluing gold. Well, there you go. I mean, it's one thing for the Dutch National Banker, the head of the Dutch National Bank, to say, yeah, we're going to revalue gold because it's in the gold revaluation account, and it should go much higher to offset our liabilities. But when you see Senator Loomis from Wyoming saying, yeah, we should do this to fund a strategic Bitcoin account, what's the difference if the West revalues it or China revalues it? In essence, a $4 premium to the Western price already is the beginning of a revaluation. So I would say silver is still the most undervalued, probably best potential asset on the planet. People understand that there are 8 banks that are holding the largest concentrated position of any commodity ever traded on COMEX in silver. Why? And it's because those 8 banks are being instructed by the people above in the West to keep it down for a reason. And maybe it is to fund the military-industrial complex. Who knows? Point of it is that all manipulations end badly, especially when you see massive efforts by countries like China and India to accumulate everything that's not nailed down, and even do so in a clandestine manner by buying doré and concentrate from the miners that doesn't come off of an exchange, that isn't reflected in the price, so that they can have a strategic advantage that no one sees coming.